In January 1972, the largest passenger liner in the world caught fire and sank in less than 3 days. But this was no ordinary ship. This was the Queen of the Atlantic. Massive, luxurious, blessed by royal hands. Built on the sweat of 750,000 soldiers during the Second World War, for 34 years, she carried millions of passengers across the ocean. Millions of people danced on her decks, dined under crystal chandeliers, slept in luxury cabins. But when the economy changed, when airplanes started flying faster than liners, the Queen was no longer needed by the world. So what happened to the world's greatest liner? She burned, completely, in 70 hours, and to this day, no one knows who did it. This is the story of a queen who sought a second chance, but found only fire. This is the story of failure, architecture, and mystery. But before we learn how she died, we need to go back 40 years, to when everything seemed possible. In the early 1930s, Cunard merged with the White Star Line to become Cunard White Star, and following their launch of the RMS Queen Mary, the world's largest passenger ship, and the new flagship of Great Britain, the British government granted Cunard White Star the funds for a running mate, a companion ship. This new vessel was intended to be larger and more technologically advanced than the Queen Mary herself. This was hull number 552, the RMS Queen Elizabeth. She was not just bigger, she was smarter. Where the Queen Mary carried 6 massive boilers, the Queen Elizabeth needed only 3. 3 boilers that burned fuel more efficiently, that could push 1,031 feet of steel across the Atlantic at speeds that still held records. She had 2,283 cabins. Staterooms with private bathrooms, drawing rooms with fireplaces, Turkish baths, and swimming pools that would rival the finest resorts on land. But before the first paying passenger ever set foot aboard, the Queen Elizabeth sailed across the ocean under cover of darkness. No passengers, no paying customers, only 750,000 soldiers, transporting troops in secret convoys across the Atlantic to prepare for war. She sailed 500,000 miles during World War II, carrying nothing but men in uniform and the weight of history. She was Churchill's secret weapon, the liner that never appears in the official records, that soldiers would remember for the rest of their lives as the ship that brought them to Europe or brought them home. When the war ended, Winston Churchill himself sent a message to the ship's captain. It said simply, "Thank you for your service to the Crown." In October 1946, the Queen Elizabeth returned to her true purpose. The first civilian passengers boarded, and what passengers they were. The most glamorous, the wealthiest, the most sophisticated people in the world, aristocrats and movie stars, industrialists and royalty itself. They dined in restaurants decorated like Versailles. They danced in ballrooms that glittered with gold leaf. They slept in cabins panelled with fine wood, their every need attended to by hundreds of crew members trained in the art of luxury. For the next decades, the Queen Elizabeth was the most desired address in the world. To sail on her was a dream. To sail in first class was immortality. But then something happened, something that no one could have predicted. Something that changed everything. In 1958, the first commercial jet airline across the Atlantic, the Boeing 707, it took 7 hours, not 7 days. By the 1960s, the great age of the ocean liner was over. Within a decade, most of the great ships were being cut up for scrap metal. The airlines had won. The future belonged to the sky, not the sea. The Queen Elizabeth, once the most desired ship in the world, was now an anachronism, a relic of a lost age. She kept sailing. She was converted to a cruise ship, sent to warm waters, given new engines and stabilizers. But everyone knew the truth. She was old. And the world was moving on. By 1965, Cunard made the difficult decision. The Queen Elizabeth's final transatlantic crossing would be in 1968, 30 years after her maiden voyage. 30 years of glory and luxury and history. And then it would be over. When Cunard realized The Queen Elizabeth could no longer make money crossing the Atlantic. They did what every struggling company does. They looked for a way out. They looked for a beer. In 1965, the RMS Queen Mary had been sold to the city of Long Beach, California, where it became a permanent hotel and museum. It was a success. Thousands of tourists paid to walk the decks of the most legendary ship ever built. Cunard saw an opportunity. If the Queen Mary could be reborn as a museum, why not the Queen Elizabeth? In 1968, after her final Atlantic crossing, the Queen Elizabeth was sold to a group of Philadelphia businessmen for $3.8 million. They had a plan. They would move the ship to Port Everglades in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. They would open her as a floating hotel and museum. Tourists would pay to see the grandeur of a bygone age. It was a beautiful dream. They renamed her Elizabeth. The ship was given a fresh coat of paint, new carpets, new life. In February 1969, the doors opened. Admission was $2.50. Thousands came. They walked through the first-class dining room with its soaring ceilings and sweeping staircases. They saw the cabins where movie stars once slept. They imagined themselves as passengers in that glorious golden age of transatlantic travel. For a few months, it seemed like the dream might work. But the dream died quickly. The ship required constant maintenance. The engines needed work. The boilers needed attention. Fires broke out in the engine room. The ship's systems, designed for a working ocean liner, couldn't handle the stress of being a stationary museum. Visitors came, but not enough to cover the mounting costs. Worse, the city of Fort Lauderdale began to see the Queen Elizabeth not as an attraction, but as a liability. There were insurance issues, there were safety concerns, there were bureaucratic nightmares. By 1970, barely a year after opening, the museum dream was collapsing. The ship that had sailed for 32 years without incident was now losing money every single day it sat in Fort Lauderdale. The banks began to circle. The owners couldn't pay their debts. The newspapers, always eager for a scandal, began to whisper about mob connections, about money laundering, about deals that didn't add up. The Florida dream became a Florida nightmare. By the end of 1970, the Queen Elizabeth had been seized. She was put up for auction. Any beer would do. The ship was poison. And then, in the depths of despair, a savior appeared. A man named Sai Tong from Hong Kong stepped forward with an offer. $3.2 million for the ship. He had a new dream, a better dream, or so he thought. He would transform the Queen Elizabeth into a floating university, a ship dedicated to teaching maritime science to students from around the world. He would call it the Seawise University. Sai Tong believed in the power of maritime education. He believed that the greatest ship in the world could still serve a noble purpose. He would recruit students from around the world. They would live aboard the ship. They would study navigation, oceanography, maritime law, and the history of seafaring. Every classroom would have a view of the open ocean. Every lecture would be held in the most luxurious auditorium ever built. It was a magnificent vision. Tong made arrangements to refit the ship. New boilers were installed. The old engines were rebuilt. A completely new fire suppression system was added to meet modern American maritime codes. The ship was repainted white and orange. A new name was painted on the hull, Seawise University. Brochures were printed. Advertisements were placed in maritime magazines around the world. The promise was extraordinary: 75-day voyages. San Francisco to Vancouver, to Hawaii to Asia to Australia. Students would learn at sea. They would see the world, the coast. Luxury cabins for passengers who could pay, with proceeds going to support student scholarships. But before the ship could begin her new life, she had to reach Hong Kong. And that voyage proved to be a harbinger of things to come. In February 1971, the Seawise University left Fort Lauderdale under her own power for the first time in years. The journey to Hong Kong was supposed to take a few weeks. It took 5 months. Only 6 of the ship's 12 boilers were operational. Maximum speed was 11 knots. The voyage that should have been routine became a nightmare. In the Caribbean, fires broke out in the boiler room. The ship lost power entirely, drifting helpless, while the crew desperately tried to restart the engines. Weeks went by. The ship limped across the Atlantic. More boiler failures, more engine trouble. By the time the Seawise University limped into Hong Kong, July 1971, the crew was exhausted, the ship was battered, and the newspapers were having a field day. One Singapore paper ran the headline, "Tarnished Queen arrives in Hong Kong," but Saitong remained undeterred. He believed in his dream. Throughout the rest of 1971, the ship underwent an intensive refit. Engineers worked around the clock. New boiler tubes were installed. The fire suppression system was upgraded again. New pumps were added. New wiring was run through the superstructure. By the end of the year, the ship was ready. The first official voyage of the Seawise University was scheduled for April 1972. The brochures were updated. The cabins were prepared. Reservations were being taken for the opening cruise. Saitong had saved the Queen Elizabeth. She would sail again. She would have a new purpose. She would be reborn. By December 1971, everything seemed to be on schedule. The year ahead looked bright. 1972 would be the year the Seawise University finally talked to the sea. No one could have imagined what was about to happen. It was a Sunday morning. A Sunday morning in January 1972. The Seawise University was docked in Hong Kong, moored at the Kai Tak shipyard. The crew was small that day. Most of the workers were on a break. Most of them were in the crew's mess, having lunch. At 11:20 in the morning, 3 fires broke out simultaneously, not sequentially, not one after another, but at the exact same time, in 3 different locations aboard the ship. One fire started in the paint locker on a deck. Another started in a cabin on B deck. The third started in the engine room. To this day, no one knows why. Within minutes, the alarm was sounded. Within an hour, the fire was everywhere. The ship's ventilation system, designed to move air throughout the vessel, became a massive chimney. The air pressure inside the ship rose. The heat intensified. The flames spread horizontally, vertically, in every direction at once. The fire brigade arrived. They turned on their water cannons. The water poured in, thousands of gallons, tens of thousands of gallons, water flooding onto the ship from every angle, from fireboats positioned all around her. But there was a problem. The ship's portholes and doors were open. The water from the cannons poured in through the open portholes on the deck, but it couldn't pour out. It pooled inside the ship. It flowed downward, into the compartments below. The water kept accumulating, kept building up, all on one side of the ship. As the weight of the water increased, the ship began to list. To lean, to tip toward starboard. The list grew worse. 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. As the ship tilted more and more, the water inside was not distributed evenly. It flowed toward the lowest point, which was now even lower because of the tilt. The center of gravity shifted. The ship was becoming unstable. The fire crews realized what was happening. They stopped the water cannons. The decision was made: let the fire burn itself out. It was a desperate gamble. If they couldn't cool the flames would consume everything. The entire superstructure would collapse. The ship would roll over completely. For the next 72 hours, the Seawise University burned. The fire consumed the first-class dining room, where generations of the world's elite had dined under crystal chandeliers. It consumed the swimming pools, the libraries, the theaters. It consumed the captain's quarters, the officers' lounges, the crew's cabins. It consumed everything that made the Queen Elizabeth the greatest ship in the world. The superstructure above the main deck turned into an inferno. The steel grew so hot that it glowed red in the night. The heat was so intense that pieces of metal fell off the ship like rain. The rivets that held the hull together began to fail. On Monday morning, January 10th, the Seawise University capsized. She rolled onto her side. Her port side came up out of the water like a dying whale. Her starboard side sank deeper into the mud of Hong Kong harbor. The fires continued to burn for 3 more days. When the flames finally died, what remained was almost unrecognizable. The entire superstructure was charred black. Great holes gaped in the hull. The ship that had carried 750,000 soldiers across the Atlantic, the ship that had hosted royalty and movie stars, the ship that was supposed to train a new generation of maritime students, lay broken and burning in Hong Kong harbor. No one was killed. The ship had been empty enough that everyone escaped. But the dream was over. In July 1972, 6 months after the fire, the official court of inquiry released its findings. The investigation had been conducted by both British and American authorities. The evidence had been examined. The survivors had been questioned. The verdict was simple and shocking. The fire was deliberately set. It was arson. But the investigators could not determine who had set the fires or why. The official report stated, "The fire was caused by persons unknown with the deliberate intention of setting multiple fires in separate parts of the ship. To this day, no one has ever been arrested. No one has ever been convicted. The person or persons responsible for the destruction of the greatest ship in the world have never been brought to justice." But there were theories. Some suspected labor unrest. The ship was at a shipyard in Hong Kong. There were workers there, union members, who resented foreign ships, who resented the British colonial legacy. Could they have done this? Could workers have deliberately burned the ship? Others suspected sabotage by a shipping competitor. If the Seawise University never sailed, it would never compete with other cruise lines, with other charter operators. Could a rival company have hired someone to destroy the ship? Still others pointed to insurance fraud. Saitong was in financial trouble. The ship had cost millions to refit. Maybe he stood to gain more from the insurance payout than from actually operating the ship. Maybe the fire wasn't a tragedy. Maybe it was a solution. But there was no evidence. No smoking gun, no confession. Some pointed to the larger political context. It was 1972. Hong Kong was still a British colony, but mainland China was becoming powerful. Was there a nationalist element to the fire, a political statement, a rejection of British capitalism and colonial excess? Again, there was no evidence. The mystery deepened. The newspapers speculated. The insurance companies investigated. The police conducted interrogations. But in the end, nothing was conclusive. Nothing was proven. The courts eventually ruled that the Seawise University had been destroyed by arson, and that the perpetrators were unknown. The case was closed. The file was sealed. Saitong claimed the insurance money. He eventually went into the shipping business in other parts of Asia. He never built another floating university. He never tried to save another old ship. The mystery of who burned the Queen Elizabeth was never solved. After the fire, the burned-out wreck of the Seawise University, Hong Kong harbor, for over a year. It was too dangerous to move. It was too damaged to salvage whole. The only option was to cut her up. From 1973 to 1976, salvage crews worked methodically to dismantle the ship. They cut through the superstructure, piece by piece, section by section. They removed over 45,000 tons of steel, which was sold to scrap yards around the world. The once great Queen Elizabeth was reduced to a pile of scrap metal, but the hull remained. The lower portions of the ship, submerged in the mud of Hong Kong harbor, were left in place. They were simply too difficult and too expensive to remove. By the late 1980s, Hong Kong was experiencing explosive growth. The shipping industry needed room. The port needed to expand. The government had a plan. They would reclaim land from the harbor. They would fill in areas where ships once sailed and turn them into land where containers could be stacked and moved by cranes. One of these land reclamation projects was the Quiet Sink container terminals. In particular, Container Terminal 9, or CT9, the project engineers looked at the maps. They saw the wreck of the Seawise University still resting on the bottom. The logical thing to do was simple: cover it up, dump fill material on top of it, bury it under the new land. So that's what they did. Today, if you stand at the Quiet Sink container terminals, directly over the spot where the Seawise University lies, you are standing on top of the greatest ship ever built. You are standing on top of the Queen Elizabeth, the ship that carried 750,000 soldiers, the ship that hosted royalty and celebrities, the ship that was supposed to train a new generation of maritime students. That ship is now buried under the concrete and dirt of a modern container terminal. The outlines of the hull can still be seen on maps. The coordinates are known, but no one visits, no one marks the spot. The Queen of the Atlantic lies forgotten under the wheels of cargo cranes. However, pieces of the Queen Elizabeth did survive. The original hull plate with the letters Q and E was salvaged from the wreck. These massive metal letters, which once identified the ship from miles away, are now preserved in a maritime museum in California. There, tourists can run their fingers over the same metal that adorned the most legendary ship in the world. The ship's anchors were salvaged and distributed to various maritime museums around the world. In Hong Kong, one of the anchors sits in a public space, a reminder of the vessel that once made the city its final port. Some of the luxury cabins were even saved. The first-class cabins, with their original paneling and furnishings, were carefully removed before the ship was demolished. One of these cabins is now in a private collection in Singapore, a complete time capsule of the golden age of ocean liners. But perhaps the strangest survival was a limited edition fountain pen. Parker Pen, the luxury pen company, commissioned exactly 100 pens made from metal salvaged from the wreck of the Seawise University. Each one was inscribed with the ship's name. These pens are now collector's items, worth thousands of dollars. They are the most expensive fountain pens ever made, because they are made from the Queen Elizabeth herself. The Queen Elizabeth experienced a strange form of immortality after her death. In 1974, the final scene of the James Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun was filmed on location in Hong Kong, using the wreck of the Seawise University as a set. The burned-out ship played the secret headquarters of a master criminal, with elaborate sets constructed inside and on top of the wreckage. So the Queen Elizabeth, in her final form, became the hiding place of a fictional supervillain. She became a movie set. She played a role in a fantasy, when she could no longer play a role in reality. And then there is the question of succession. The Queen Elizabeth had been the flagship of the Cunard line. She had the most prestigious name in all of maritime history. When she was destroyed in 1972, Cunard did not retire the name. Instead, they commissioned a new ship, the Queen Elizabeth II, or QE2. She was a magnificent vessel, a floating palace of steel and glass, but she was smaller than the original. She was designed for a different era. She carried fewer passengers, accommodated fewer crew members. The QE2 sailed for nearly 40 years, from 1969 until 2008. She carried millions of passengers across the Atlantic and around the world. She was beloved and legendary in her own right. But she was not as grand as the original Queen Elizabeth. She was not as large, not as luxurious, not as revolutionary. She was a continuation of a legacy, but not a fulfillment of it. And when the QE2 was finally retired in 2008, Cunard again refused to let the name die. They commissioned a new ship, the RMS Queen Elizabeth. She is a modern cruise ship, built by a Dutch company, carrying 2,081 passengers instead of the original's 2,283. She's fast, efficient, comfortable, and completely devoid of the character and grandeur that defined her legendary namesake. The name survives, the legend persists, but the queen that was the Queen Elizabeth is gone. She lies in the mud, beneath the container cranes of Hong Kong, a monument to a lost age, to a time when ships were built to last, to a time when luxury meant something more than thread count and view of the ocean. The Queen Elizabeth was the last of her kind, and she died in flames, burned by persons unknown, in the harbour of Hong Kong, while the world wasn't looking.